The dimension tool is the next documentation tool I want to talk about. In the dimension tool right here, the standard dimension tool, we have geometry method for arc length as well as sloped versus orthogonal geometry methods. Now the angled geometry method can be applied to angles, or it can maintain an orthogonality to the model. So for example, clicking here and here on that diagonal, I can, using that method, line up with that diagonal, or if I zoom in, you can see that I get that little parallel cursor indicating that I'm parallel to that line. So even though I am dimensioning using this angled dimension, it remains orthogonal to the screen. With my dimension tool in particular, there are a few favorites, not dimension styles, but dimension tool. The first favorite that we want to look at is just this dimension, AG dimensions with leader. What that's saying is essentially if I have a dimension, say from this grid line, I'm clicking on the grid line with the pencil cursor and clicking on this wall core right here with that pencil cursor, and then double clicking. That leader is essentially, if I need this out of the way, it's going to automatically add a leader right there to basically indicate that that's what's being dimensioned to. Also with the dimension styles, dimension types, and appearance is this tick mark. So we have a couple of different marker types that we use. Face of stud is the single slash, open circle is center line, and open arrow is face of finish. The dimension can also be preset to dimension to the core faces, outer faces, or the reference line of the dimension. What I do oftentimes with that dimension tool is set it to the core faces, and this is particularly important for preliminary models where I just want to see what this dimension line is, or the dimension length is, so that I can tell like the level of precision and accuracy within my model. And then I'm just clicking on these walls and you can see it's dimensioning both sides of that core face. Because that's what the dimension is set to. And then double click and place that dimension. So then I can look for any red flags, any 64ths or 32nds that shouldn't be there. The dimension is associated to these walls, so if the wall moves, the dimensions move with it. I can then click on individual nodes of that dimension string. So I can click right here and say that this dimension node is going to go away. And that allows me to quickly clean up which face of the wall I'm dimensioning to. Additionally, you can relocate dimensions. So if I click on that dimension right here, I can say that I want to move that dimension association on the pet palette here, and I can associate that dimension to the grid line. So now if the grid line moves, that dimension moves with it. I can add additional dimensions to the dimension string. If I hold down Command and click on another node, it associates a new dimension node, a new dimension segment to that element. And again, it's associated to that element, so if that element moves, the dimension moves with it. This question comes up a lot in putting custom text or modifying the dimension string. It does not modify what that dimension is moved or dimensioned to. You can have this measured value as a text and put in custom text in addition to it. But we do not want to ever overwrite dimensions. If this is supposed to be 12 foot 8.5, we want to model that to 12 foot 8.5, and we don't want to mess with modifying or overwrite the dimensions. Our dimension styles are also set to the nearest 64th of an inch, and that's intentional so that if we have dimension strings that are adding up, for something like this, that the segments do not add up to different than the total. The sum of the parts is equal to the total. Rounding errors can cause that to be inaccurate because the 1/8 inch, for example, might be rounded down on one segment and rounded up on another segment if we're rounding to the nearest 1/8. So we are modeling, designing, and documenting to the nearest 64th, not because we want 64ths in our documents, but because that's what makes it easiest to model precisely. Now, if I have a dimension that's going from a center line, say the center line of this grid to the face of the stud here, there is no way to select that dimension segment and edit just the marker type of that segment. So what we have in our favorites is essentially a cumulative dimension type, but we can just switch that type here in the geometry method. And what that does, if I just click out here arbitrarily and place a dimension string, This is not a dimension type that we use, except that it allows us to have an open circle on one end. In fact, it has to be an open circle at the origin of the dimension string, and then a different dimension type at the other end. The downside to this is that obviously 7'1" from here to here, and then an origin from here to here is 15'4". So it's sort of more like a builder's dimension standard where they're pulling a tape measure across the floor and just marking off those dimensions. We don't annotate that way, but we might need an open circle here indicating center line, and then that open tick mark here indicating face of stud. So by adding that dimension here, I can then have that open circle and that tick mark. I can then eyedrop this dimension type, switch to the open circle, and essentially piece this together as individual segments. Now, there is no way to go from face of finish to face of stud with a tick mark and an arrow on the same dimension string, but I don't know that that's ever come up because typically face of finish is only for sort of special case plans. Anyway, so that is, and you can see right here the model has this level of inaccuracy where there's these 64ths just riddled around. Catching that early is really critical to maintaining a clean and healthy model. Additionally, there's a couple of other tricks that you can do with the dimension string if you need to get rid of a segment, because oftentimes dimension strings that add up like this are sort of against our graphic standard. We want to dimension the grid lines, and then we want to dimension individual segments to those grid lines. So maybe I don't need this dimension string right here. I can select that dimension string and delete it. And that's just by selecting the center line of that dimension string right here. Again, you can also reassociate by command click and dimension to that other element. You can also combine multiple dimension strings by holding down command and click and recombining those into a single dimension string. So command click is not just for trimming, as we looked at in session 1, roofs to each other or trimming walls and beams and things like that. Command click is also useful for combining dimension segments.